Boston Harbor, August 1944. Fog rolled in off the Atlantic, thick as a soldier's wool blanket, muffling the clang of steel cranes. The Liberty ships loomed in gray silhouette, their decks crowded with cargo that never seemed to end. Crates, barrels, pallets, stacked higher than a man's head. Corporal Vittorio Russo, a lean bersagliere with sun-baked skin from the Tunisian desert, bent his shoulders against a wooden pallet marked Beer, South Boston Depot. The scent of malt drifted into the morning air, mingling with salt, diesel fumes, and creosote from the pier. For Russo, it was a smell almost unreal, prisoners handling luxuries his officers in Africa had never tasted during campaigns. Nearby, reporters scribbled in pads as Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt, Boston Port of Embarkation Commander, gestured toward the laboring Italians. His words carried across the pier. Their labor is badly needed, more than satisfactory, industrious, willing, intelligent. He spoke like a man conscious of public opinion, yet beneath it was an admission that startled many American listeners. The ports would stumble without these men who once wore the enemy's insignia. Russo caught a guard's eye as he straightened. Private Joe Santangelo, a Brooklyn Italian-American barely in his 20s, leaned on his rifle with casual ease. He gave Russo a half-smile, almost a nod of respect, before glancing back at the endless convoys lined up to haul supplies inland. Rows of GMC CCKW trucks, the famous 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-halfs, rumbled and coughed diesel smoke. Russo could not stop staring. In North Africa, his regiment had relied on mule carts and half-empty fuel drums. Here, even prisoners labored among machines built in numbers so vast they seemed to erase the memory of scarcity. Russo whispered to a fellow POW, his voice rough with disbelief. "Even their prisoners eat better than our officers did." It was not hyperbole. By Geneva law, Article 11 of the 1929 Convention, POWs received the same rations as American depot troops: bread, meat, coffee, sugar, even cigarettes. To men raised on meager rations of black bread and olive oil, the meals seemed feasts. And the pay, 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, $24 a month, was more money than Russo had earned as a soldier under Mussolini's banner. Yet it was not just food or pay that unsettled him. It was the rhythm of abundance itself. The United States Army had accepted nearly 2.4 million trucks between 1939 and 1945. Russo could see them in motion even here, convoys stretching like metallic rivers through the city streets, each vehicle fresh painted and fitted with tires the Axis could no longer afford to dream of. He paused, hands resting on the pallet jack, watching as a rail car door clattered open to reveal another wall of crates. Beer, again, so much that Americans could afford to drown their troops in it. For Russo, that single sight struck harder than any weapon. America was winning not by bayonet, but by boxcar. The harbor fog and abundance would have seemed a hallucination had Russo not known the path that brought him here. Only the year before, he had stood under a sky filled with Saharan grit, his boots cracked from heat, his canteen near dry. It was April 1943 when the Italian First Army collapsed in Tunisia, cornered between Montgomery's Eighth Army and Eisenhower's Anglo-American advance. Vittorio Russo, one of tens of thousands, laid down his rifle in a wadi littered with broken helmets. He remembered the silence after the last artillery crash, a silence filled only with flies and the low groans of the wounded. From that battlefield, the Americans began a process that shocked the prisoners as much as defeat itself. The Liberty ships that carried tanks, fuel, and men to Africa did not return empty. They carried POWs, Italians, then Germans, packed into steel holds for the Atlantic crossing. Russo's ship creaked and groaned in storm swells, but its crew fed them 3 meals a day, issued blankets, and even allowed time on deck for air. It was captivity, yes, but not the brutality many had feared. When the Statue of Liberty appeared out of the mist one May morning, Russo could hardly process that he had been brought to the very city Italians once dreamed of as emigrants. Processing camps in New Jersey gave way to the Great Dispersal. By 1943 and 1944, over 50,000 Italians were scattered across America's interior: Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp Hereford in Texas, hundreds of branch camps tucked into cornfields and timber stands. At Hereford, more than 5,000 men lived beneath the endless Texas sky, the wind cutting dust into every corner of the barracks. At Atterbury, 3,000 built a chapel in the meadow from scrap lumber and stone, carving reminders of home in enemy soil. Russo remembered stepping off the train that first delivered him inland. Rows of barbed wire glistened in the sun, but beyond the fences stretched farmland rich with corn and wheat. Guards looked more like farm boys than conquerors. They were citizen soldiers, mechanics, truck drivers, clerks turned into uniformed keepers of war's detritus. He had expected hostility. Instead, he found routine. Meals served by the clock. Canteens stocked with soap and chocolate. Even movies screened in the evenings. The Americans followed the rules to the letter. Geneva's Article 11, he would later learn, guaranteed it. In the desert, he had been hungry and hollow-eyed, commanded by officers who themselves starved. In America, he found full bellies and pay slips, even as a prisoner. By the time whispers spread through the barracks about a new program, volunteers could serve in Italian service units, working under the American flag but marked as Italy. Russo already sensed the war's truth. The Allies fought with men like him, but also with convoys, rations, and factories that no Axis power could match. As the camp loudspeaker barked names for the first service unit detail, Russo stood, hesitated only a moment, and stepped forward. The panhandle wind whistled across the barracks roofs of Camp Hereford, carrying with it the smell of dust and cattle from the plains beyond. Vittorio Russo rose from his cot at dawn to the bugle's call, his breath visible in the cool air despite the Texas sun promising heat later in the day. The compound stretched wide, with barbed wire glinting like silver thread against the horizon. To Russo, it felt less like a prison and more like a strange halfway world, caught between war and something that looked suspiciously like peace. Breakfast was served promptly at 700, scrambled eggs, bread thick as a fist, a tin mug of hot coffee. Russo had not tasted such a meal in years. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, Article 11, the food ration for prisoners was to be equal to that of depot troops. The Americans obeyed it with a precision that stunned their captives. Tobacco was issued weekly, potable water constant. Even the salt shakers on the mess tables seemed an extravagance. After roll call, guards escorted work details outside the wire. Private Joe Santangelo, assigned as escort that morning, walked among them with his rifle slung loosely at his side. Russo studied the young Italian-American's face, hearing the Brooklyn accent when Santangelo gave instructions. There was familiarity in his tone, like kinship across an ocean. Santangelo himself felt it too. He thought of his father, who had left Naples in 1912 and never looked back. Now here were men who might have been cousins, captured in North Africa, their uniforms stripped but their language intact. The day's labor was light, repairing fences, unloading feed for the livestock herds that supplemented camp supplies. For this, Russo would earn 80 cents in camp scrip, part of the standard $24 a month granted to working POWs. It was not cash, but it bought him cigarettes, soap, chocolate, or even a fountain pen at the canteen. Compared to the lira he had once been paid in Mussolini's army, the stipend felt almost like insult turned into opportunity. At night, the barracks hummed with routine, cards slapped against tabletops, a harmonica wheezed a folk tune, letters were written home in cramped script. A projector flickered across a bedsheet, showing American newsreels of convoys moving across France and bombers soaring over Europe. Rousseau watched in silence, trying to reconcile the images with his own memories of retreat and collapse. Yet beneath the monotony ran a current of change. Rumors spread of a new program, the Italian service units. Word was that men could volunteer to work for the Americans in uniform marked Italy. They would earn pay, receive passes, even spend Sundays outside the wire. To some it smelled of betrayal, to others, survival. One evening, the camp loudspeaker barked names, calling for volunteers to step forward. Rousseau's heart pounded as he rose from his bunk. The war had already taken everything from him. Perhaps this choice could give something back. The uniform arrived in February 1944, stiff with new cloth and dyed olive drab, nearly identical to that of an American GI. But across the back, in bold white stencils, a single word announced its distinction: Italy. Vittorio Rousseau ran his fingers across the letters, feeling both pride and unease. He was no longer merely a prisoner. He was part of an Italian service unit, working under American command, yet wearing a mark that declared his nation's uncertain allegiance. The shift was more than cosmetic. Overnight, the barbed wire became less confining. ISU men were marched not into fields or fences, but into the machinery of war itself, docks, depots, and hospitals where their labor kept the Allied juggernaut supplied. Rousseau's unit, 40 men strong, was assigned to the Boston port of embarkation, where Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt ran operations with clockwork efficiency. There, Liberty ships disgorged endless streams of material, rifles, rations, boots, tires, and ISU men hauled it all into warehouses that seemed to stretch without end. It was not only labor that changed. Pay increased, still 80 cents a day, but now with broader privileges. Passes allowed Rousseau and his comrades to walk Boston's North End on Sundays, escorted but free enough to attend Mass and sit at tables where Italian-American families served pasta, bread, and wine. Civilians like Mary O'Connor, a parish volunteer, welcomed them with cautious kindness. She marveled at their courtesy, their hunger for conversation, their gratitude for meals that echoed home. What struck Rousseau most was not generosity alone, but abundance. In 1 week, he helped unload rail cars of beer. The next, it was crates of chocolate bars bound for Europe. Then came aircraft engines, each packed in grease and sawdust, lifted by cranes into trucks. America's industry seemed to manufacture miracles by the ton. Rousseau calculated in his head, this single harbor could equip more soldiers in a month than Italy had supplied in years of war. The statistics bore him out. By war's end, over 45,000 Italian POWs would join ISUs, contributing more than 90 million man-days of labor. The value was estimated at $230 million, savings that freed American soldiers for combat. DeWitt himself admitted, their labor is badly needed. For Rousseau, it was more than labor, it was revelation. One Sunday evening after returning from the parish, he stood on the pier watching convoys of GMC CCKWs roll out into the night, headlights blinking in rhythm. He whispered to himself in disbelief, "America fights the war with warehouses." The pier clanged with iron hooks and shouted orders as Vittorio Rousseau bent his back into another pallet, this time stacked with cartons marked Rations Type K. The boxes were light enough, but what struck him was their number. Crates upon crates, rising like a fortress wall, each destined to feed an American soldier somewhere across the Atlantic. He had heard the phrase, "An army marches on its stomach." But this was no march. It was a banquet on wheels. Day after day, the work seemed endless. 1 week it was cigarettes, hundreds of cases stacked with military precision, bound for Europe where GIs would light them between firefights. Another week it was chocolate bars, packed in wax paper. the kind American soldiers would hand to French children or slip into their helmets before battle. Rousseau remembered how his own unit in Tunisia had received hard crusts of black bread, a thin smear of oil, and bitter coffee stretched with chicory. Here, even the combat luxuries came in mountains. The Americans recorded everything with bureaucratic precision. His service unit's tally sheet showed pallets lifted, tons moved, hours logged. When General DeWitt walked the warehouse floor, clipboard in hand, he stopped to remark to a reporter, "We could not maintain operations without them." Their work is more than satisfactory to Rousseau. The admission felt like a strange sort of validation. He had lost his rifle, lost his flag, but here he was, useful, even praised, to the very enemy who had defeated him. Sundays, the routine shifted. Passes allowed him into Boston's North End, where Italian faces greeted him with warmth. Mary O'Connor arranged parish suppers in a basement hall that smelled of tomato sauce and fresh bread. Children darted between tables, laughing in a language that mingled English and dialect. Rousseau sat among them, eating until he was full, stunned by the generosity of strangers who owed him nothing. When he left each week, his pocket sometimes held an apple, a slice of bread, or even a bottle of wine pressed into his hands as if he were kin. The contrast gnawed at him. He thought of Italy, bombed and starving, his brother still in Abruzzo, standing in ration lines that dwindled by the day. Here, warehouses overflowed with goods so plentiful they seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. The numbers told the story plain. Italian service units nationwide contributed over 90 million man-days of work. The U.S. Army valued their labor at $230 million. But to Rousseau, the true figure was in sight alone. One convoy of trucks rolling out each night, headlights glowing like fireflies, carrying more supplies than his regiment had seen in its entire campaign. He confided to Mary one evening, voice low, "America fights the war with warehouses." She laughed softly, not realizing it was less a joke than an awakening. That night, lying in his barracks bunk, Rousseau's thoughts wandered back to North Africa. He remembered the day his regiment had been ordered to hold a ridge while the Germans withdrew fuel-starved panzers. Dust rose in choking clouds as tanks ground forward on fumes, crews rationing every liter of gasoline like liquid gold. Behind them, Italian supply carts creaked, pulled by mules whose ribs showed through their hides. Men gnawed on dried bread, their rifles rusting from sand and sweat. In those days, the idea of abundance had been a fantasy. Now, each day in Boston forced him to confront the truth. America did not merely outnumber the Axis in men, it overwhelmed them with machines. Convoys of GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks thundered through city streets, each capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of cargo. Rousseau learned that more than 500,000 of these trucks had rolled off assembly lines, 572,000 to be exact. It was a number so vast he could hardly grasp it. Italy, he thought bitterly, had struggled to maintain a few thousand functioning vehicles in North Africa. Germany relied on horse-drawn wagons for nearly 3/4 of its logistics. The revelation grew sharper each time he touched a crate. Cigarettes alone, packed by the millions, equaled luxuries his officers had denied themselves at the front. Beer, stacked railcar after railcar, was something his comrades had never seen in the field. Even the waste amazed him. Broken pallets burned for kindling, spilled coffee swept aside, boots discarded because the leather scuffed. For the Axis, any one of those discards would have been salvaged, patched, worn until the last stitch gave way. In the barracks, men argued about what it meant. Some cursed the humiliation. Others, like Rousseau, stared at the numbers and knew the conclusion. "If America can waste more than we can produce," he told a friend quietly, "the war was already lost before it began." His comrade nodded, silent, staring at the glow of the convoy beyond the wire. Russo wrote to his brother in Abruzzo, though he knew the letter might never arrive. He described the meals, the cigarettes, even the chocolate. He wanted his family to know there was a land across the sea where hunger was a stranger. It was captivity, yes, but also revelation. The abundance was not propaganda. It was daily life. As lights flickered out in the barracks, Russo rolled over, listening to the rumble of trucks beyond the fence. The sound was steady, endless, like thunder that never ceased. That was the sound of victory, he realized. The warehouse air was heavy with dust and the sharp tang of machine oil. Vittorio Russo wiped his palms on his trousers, then bent again to grip the rope of a cargo net swinging from a crane. The bundle contained munitions, crates of rifle ammunition marked in stenciled black, destined for Europe. Around him, his service unit worked with practiced rhythm, guiding nets to the ground, stacking crates into waiting trucks. They were not soldiers anymore, but they were laborers whose effort fueled the same war that had once crushed them. Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt walked the floor that afternoon, clipboard tucked under his arm. His polished boots struck sharp against the concrete as he stopped before a group of reporters touring the facility. Gesturing at the POWs sweating beneath the rigging, he spoke with characteristic bluntness. Their labor is badly needed. More than satisfactory, industrious, willing, intelligent. The words, written into newsprint the next day, carried more than flattery. They revealed a logistical truth. Without Italian service units, the port would falter. Russo felt the irony keenly. Only a year before, he had been ordered to hold a ridge in Tunisia against American fire. Now his hands loaded the very ammunition meant to defeat his former allies. Yet the work gave him purpose, and in some strange way, dignity. He was not wasting away behind barbed wire, but part of something immense, even if unwilling. The statistics reached him later through rumor. ISUS nationwide had logged over 90 million man-days of labor. The U.S. Army estimated the value at $230 million, an impossible figure to Italians who remembered pay that barely fed their families. For every man like Russo stacking crates in Boston, another worked in New York or Norfolk or Charleston, each freeing an American GI for combat in France. Together, their effort was equivalent to divisions of soldiers reclaimed for the front. At night, when Russo returned to the barracks, he often lay awake listening to the distant horns of departing ships. He imagined their cargo, food, weapons, boots, blankets, beer, enough to feed and equip not one army but many. In his mind's eye, he saw convoys stretching across oceans, and he wondered how any nation could hope to oppose it. The next morning the work began again, cranes creaking, ropes taut, trucks rumbling into formation. Russo tightened his grip on the rope, his muscles aching but steady. He thought of DeWitt's words, industrious, willing, intelligent, and realized they were not compliments alone. They were acknowledgments that even prisoners had become part of America's overwhelming machine. Dusk settled over Boston, painting the harbor in steel-gray light as a convoy of trucks roared down the pier. GMC CKW 2.5-tonners, headlights glowing in perfect rhythm, moved with the certainty of a tide. Each vehicle carried 10,000 pounds of supplies. Each belonged to a fleet numbering over 500,000. The sound was deafening, diesel engines growling, gears grinding, tires squealing on wet pavement. For Vittorio Russo, it was less the noise than the scale that left him stunned. Private Joe Santangelo leaned on his rifle nearby, watching Russo's eyes track the convoy. "Deuce and a halfs," he explained with a hint of pride. "We build 'em by the thousands every week, keep the whole damn war moving." To Joe, it was fact. To Russo, it was revelation. His regiment in North Africa had fought for weeks with carts drawn by mules. Germany, he knew, still depended on horse-drawn wagons for nearly three-quarters of its logistics. Here, even the guards spoke casually of fleets so vast they could barely be counted. Rousseau imagined the assembly lines in Detroit and Pontiac, the stamping presses hammering steel, the rivers of rubber turned into tires. The numbers whispered among POWs defied belief. Nearly 2.4 million trucks accepted by the U.S. Army between 1939 and 1945. More vehicles than the Axis had ever dreamed of, more wheels than roads could carry. If war was a contest of movement, America had already won. The convoy rattled past crates of chocolate and cigarettes, luxuries loaded as casually as rifles. Rousseau thought of his comrades in Italy scraping tobacco dust from empty pouches, chewing chestnut leaves to mimic the taste. Here, Americans burned through cigarettes by the crate and brewed coffee in kettles big enough to drown a mule. The contrast was merciless. Mary O'Connor, walking back from the parish that evening, paused to watch the trucks as well. She marveled at their order, their noise, their unstoppable rhythm. To her, they were simply part of the war effort. To Rousseau, they were an unstoppable argument. He muttered half to himself, "If America can waste more than we can produce, what hope did we have?" Joe overheard, and for a moment there was silence between guard and prisoner. Then Joe gave a shrug, almost apologetic, as if to say abundance was not arrogance. It was simply America being itself. Rousseau lowered his eyes, but the thought echoed through him all night as the convoy's growl faded into the distance. That sound, he realized, was not just transport. It was doctrine. It was democracy in motion, mechanized and multiplied until resistance seemed absurd. News traveled slowly in camp, carried by rumor and amplified in whispers after lights out. In late August 1944, word reached Boston that a tragedy had unfolded far across the continent in Seattle. At Fort Lawton, a riot had erupted between African-American soldiers and Italian prisoners of war. The night ended with the death of a prisoner, Guglielmo Olivoto, found hanging from a wire after chaos tore through the compound. For men like Vittorio Rousseau, the story struck with both fear and confusion. Until then, captivity in America had meant rules, fairness, and, unbelievably, plenty. The Geneva Convention's protections had been honored, and guards like Joe Santangelo treated them with courtesy. But now the tale of Olivoto's death revealed fractures in the facade. America, abundant and powerful, still carried contradictions that its enemies seized upon. German propaganda crowed about the event, pointing to hypocrisy in American democracy. Mary O'Connor overheard the POWs murmuring about it during Sunday parish dinners. She struggled to explain that her country was not perfect, that prejudice and violence existed even in a land of laws. "But we face it," she told Rousseau softly across the table. "We don't hide from it." She spoke with quiet conviction, though even she knew the wound ran deep. The Army responded quickly, convening courts-martial that condemned dozens of black soldiers, sentences that decades later would be overturned. In 1944, however, the verdict satisfied neither justice nor clarity. To the Italians, it was proof that even in a land of endless warehouses, something fragile lay beneath. To Rousseau, it was a sobering reminder. Power did not mean perfection, yet the contradiction did not erase the daily reality. Each morning he still ate eggs and bread, drank hot coffee, and worked among convoys of trucks that thundered toward the front. Cigarettes were still issued, chocolate still plentiful. The abundance remained undeniable. The tragedy at Fort Lawton was a shadow across a landscape of light, dark but narrow, unable to obscure the greater vision of America's strength. That evening, lying on his bunk, Rousseau thought of Olivoto's lonely death. He thought of his own family, struggling in war-torn Abruzzo. He thought of Santangelo, who treated him like a man rather than an enemy. And he thought of Mary, who insisted that America's greatness lay not in perfection, but in the freedom to confront its own failures. As sleep finally took him, Rousseau realized the truth. Even shadows confirmed the presence of light. December 1945 arrived with a chill wind that cut across Boston Harbor. The war was over, victory secured, and the ships that once brought POWs to America now prepared to take them home. On the pier, Italian service units lined up in formation. Uniforms marked Italy, pressed and clean, sea bags slung across shoulders. Among them stood Vittorio Rousseau, staring at the skyline one last time. The city had become familiar, warehouses looming like fortresses, cranes frozen in mid-lift, the North End spires rising above brick streets. He remembered parish suppers with Mary O'Connor, the laughter of children, the taste of warm bread. He remembered Sant'Angelo's casual grin, his Brooklyn accent, his quiet respect. And he remembered the convoys, endless rivers of steel that had shown him the true scale of American war-making. Repatriation orders came with military precision. After August 8, 1945, Italian POWs began shipping home in phases. By December, most were gone from Massachusetts camps. Nationwide, the process stretched into early 1946. Rousseau's group boarded under watchful eyes, though the atmosphere was no longer hostile. Guards shook hands, even exchanged cigarettes. For men who had once faced each other across desert battlefields, there was no enmity left, only weary recognition. As Rousseau climbed the gangplank, he looked back. General DeWitt's words echoed in his memory. "Their labor is badly needed." He thought of the 90 million man-days contributed by men like him, the $230 million saved, the thousands of GIs freed for combat. He had been a prisoner, but also a cog in the greatest logistical machine the world had ever seen. On deck, he leaned against the railing. The December air was sharp with salt and coal smoke. The harbor skyline shimmered in winter sunlight. For a moment he imagined what it would be like to stay, to work in a factory, to walk the North End freely, to live in a land where even prisoners had eaten better than officers in Mussolini's army. Mary had pressed a rosary into his hand at their last meeting, whispering, "God go with you, Vittorio." "Come back one day, if you can," Sant'Angelo, with a grin that masked sentiment, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good luck, paisan." Rousseau held both memories close as the ship's whistle bellowed across the water. The vessel shuddered, pulled from the dock. Boston's cranes and warehouses began to recede. Vittorio Rousseau watched until the skyline blurred, then whispered into the wind, "One day I will return." The voyage home stretched long, but the numbers Vittorio Rousseau had seen in America lingered in his mind. They were more than statistics. They were weapons, as decisive as any rifle or tank. Lying in his bunk on the rolling ship, he recalled the convoys thundering through Boston, headlights glowing in endless rhythm. Each truck was a figure in a larger equation that had rewritten the war. The United States Army had accepted nearly 2.4 million trucks between 1939 and 1945. Just the GMC CCKW 2.5-tonners, 572,000 produced, outnumbered the entire mechanized strength of Axis armies combined. At the Boston port alone, he had seen more vehicles in a week than Mussolini's divisions had possessed in entire campaigns. The figures extended beyond machines. Italian service units, his own unit among them, had logged over 90 million man-days of labor. The War Department valued that at $230 million, enough to equip multiple combat divisions. Each day Rousseau had lifted crates, he had unknowingly freed another American soldier to fight in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in Germany itself. Even food became arithmetic. Geneva's Article 11 guaranteed POWs the same rations as depot troops. Eggs, bread, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, issued without hesitation. By contrast, Italy's home front had crumbled under ration cards, its citizens standing in lines for scraps. Rousseau knew now that America's greatest weapon was not secrecy or cunning, it was abundance. They produced so much that they could extend comfort even to their enemies without weakening their war effort. He remembered one impossible figure whispered in the barracks. In a single week, American factories produced more trucks than Italy had fielded in all of North Africa. The prisoners laughed at the absurdity, but the laughter carried a bitter edge. They had been defeated long before surrender, not by skill or valor, but by mathematics written in steel and rubber. The revelation stung, but it also inspired. Rousseau realized that democracy had proven its power not only in ballots but in factories, in ports, in farms. Every citizen became part of the arsenal, and every boxcar of beer, every crate of chocolate, every truck that rumbled through Boston was proof of a system that could not be matched. As waves crashed against the hull, Rousseau closed his eyes. The war was over, but the numbers remained, carved into memory as surely as any battle. They were statistics that felt like thunder. In the years after his return, Italy lay in ruins, cities bombed to rubble, farmland scarred by retreating armies, families stretched thin by hunger. Rousseau tried to resume life in Abruzzo, but the shadow of America remained with him. He told his brother about the meals, the pay, the parish dinners. He described convoys of trucks, warehouses of rations, crates of cigarettes stacked higher than walls. His family listened with disbelief as if he were recounting a fable, but Rousseau knew it was no myth. Thousands of former POWs shared similar memories, scattering across Italy with stories of America's fairness and abundance. Some would emigrate within a few years, joining the waves of Italians who stepped through Ellis Island, seeking work and freedom in the very nation that had once held them captive. Others stayed, but their vision of America reshaped their politics, their hopes, their children's futures. For Rousseau, the dream endured. He carried Mary O'Connor's rosary in his pocket and remembered Joe Santangelo's farewell, a handshake across cultures and uniforms. He lived long enough to see Italy rebuilt, aligned with the West, its democracy fragile but real. And he lived long enough to return once more, decades later, walking the streets of Boston as a free man. The cranes were gone, the Liberty ships rusted away, but the memory of warehouses filled with abundance still echoed. He raised a glass of American beer in a tavern, smiling at the irony. Once that very drink had been a symbol of impossible plenty. Now it was ordinary, accessible. For Rousseau, it remained extraordinary. The legacy of those years was more than labor or statistics. It was the revelation that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in the ability to share, even with enemies. The Italian POWs had discovered democracy not in lectures but in meals, in payslips, in kindness from strangers. They had returned home dreaming of life in America because they had seen its soul in abundance and fairness. As he aged, Rousseau often repeated one phrase to his grandchildren: "Remember, America fights wars with warehouses." They laughed, not fully understanding. But for him it was the truest description of what he had witnessed. A nation whose factories and farms, trucks and rations, generosity and discipline had overwhelmed tyranny. On his final visit to Boston, standing by the harbor where he had once unloaded boxcars of beer, Rousseau whispered the words again. "Even prisoners dreamed here.